and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Sherry Goodman. I am the President and CEO of the Consortium for Ocean Leadership and a board member and executive committee member here at the Council. I'm delighted to be here with all of you for this Commander Series titled Protecting the Homeland, and with Admiral Bill Gortney, the commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and NORTHCOM. And as always, I'd like to thank Saab North America for their steadfast support for this Commander Series, which we have done together at the Council since 2007. It's one of the flagship series that the Council hosts, and we're happy that we're able to carry on this great tradition with Admiral Gortney today. And it's also great that Michael Anderson is with us from Saab, North America's President and CEO, as well as an Atlantic Council Board Director, who will come up shortly to introduce the Admiral. Mike, thank you for all you do and for the great relationship between Saab and the Council. So we always gather here at the Council in the context of the transatlantic relationship. And I just happened to come right now from the State Department, where we're celebrating 25 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the Atlantic Council was privileged to co-host an event with Secretary Kerry and the German President to celebrate that marvelous event, which reminds us all of the hopefulness of the reunification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. So we should keep that in mind as we think about the challenges that we face today in this very turbulent world: the crisis in Europe's east, the brutal war in Syria, the Islamic State's oppressive rule in parts of Iraq and Syria, the growing power of China, the continued belligerent stance of North Korea, and the looming threat of climate change and the new challenges in the Arctic all come together to create a massive challenge that we must all face. And in this emerging era of major power competition, the threat of terrorism still looms large, and Islamic State-inspired attacks have happened on our soil in recent months, and we've had always another attack similar to the size of 9/11 we must protect against. In a connected world, terrorist organizations can inspire attacks by posting tweets, Facebook posts, or simply images that lead a terrorist to commit heinous acts anywhere in the world. And while terrorism has been with us a long time, this is certainly a new age of hyperconnectivity. And that's why we're so lucky today to have Admiral Gortney with us to discuss what he and his commands are doing to protect the homeland. Many of the threats I've described can affect us within our borders, and the Admiral is at the forefront of ensuring that no harm comes to Americans here at home. We're also extremely fortunate to have a journalist of Eric Schmidt's caliber to lead the Admiral and us through a discussion on these topics after the Admiral's opening remarks. Thank you, Eric, for your great and long distinguished career and for your engagement here with the Council as well. Well, with that, we have a lot to talk about, so let's get right into it. I'd like to bring up Mike to introduce the Admiral.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Anderson again, President and CEO of Saab North America. Since the establishment of Saab in 1937, we have grown from a relatively small and dedicated operation building airplanes for the Swedish government to a worldwide global provider of defense solutions over the years. Here in the U.S., we've been active for more than 40 years, supplying the U.S. government with our products and technology, often in partnership with U.S. industry. During that time, we have also been actively promoting not only a close and robust U.S. and Swedish bilateral relationship, but also a strong transatlantic relationship between U.S., Canada, and Europe in general. And that's why our partnership with the Atlantic Council and the Commander Series is so valuable and important for us. And that's also why we're so pleased that so many of you would choose to come here today on such a gorgeous, nice October afternoon. Thank you very much. With that said, it's now a great pleasure and honor to introduce Admiral William Bill Gortney today. Admiral Gortney is the commander of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, better known as NORAD, and the U.S. Northern Command, which he assumed in December of last year. Bill Gortney is the son of a retired U.S. Navy captain and a second-generation naval aviator. He's a graduate from Elon College, North Carolina, was commissioned in the United States Naval Reserve in 1977, and earned his Naval Aviator wings the following year. Since that time, he has served in many significant positions at sea and ashore. Notably, among his several overseas assignments, Admiral Gortney commanded forces in the U.S. Central Command, Area of Operation, providing support in maritime security operations and combat operations for operations enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom. He also served in the region in various capacities in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. His first flag tour was as the Deputy Chief Staff, Global Force Management and Joint Operations, U.S. Fleet Forces Command between 2004 and 2006. From 2010 to 2012, he served as Director Joint Staff. His most recent assignment was as a Commander, U.S. Fleet Forces Command. Admiral Gortney has flown over 4,300 mishap-free flight hours and completed over 1,200 carrier-arrested landings. Primarily,
more than Tim Keating.
excellent. Primarily on the A7 and the FA-18, I understand, right? And he's a highly decorated officer, recipient of several service medals. And these are just a few highlights of your very impressive career. And we're very happy that you could join us today. Please join me in welcoming Admiral Gortney to the stage.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Very kind introduction. Okay, turn this thing on. Do you need it in this room? Yeah, can you hear me okay? I'm getting a nod from Fossil back there. Well, thanks for that very kind introduction. It's an honor and a privilege. I'm going to step down so I can see you eye to eye. Honor and a privilege to be here with you today. And I want to talk to you a little bit about NORAD and NORTHCOM and the challenges that we are facing and how we go about it, because most people don't really understand NORAD and NORTHCOM. You know, NORAD, 57 years old, young this year, born of the Cold War, shaped by, quite frankly, 9/11. And NORTHCOM, which was born in 9/11 and then shaped by both 9/11 and Katrina, back when Admiral Keating was the commander back then. And we've evolved since then. Quite frankly, we've evolved past those particular points. NORAD, most people really know us for one no-fail mission, tracking Santa. And if you have kids or grandchildren, you know about that. It is a no-fail mission. I had people calling me once I got announced to this job, and I hadn't heard for years. Don't screw this up. Please don't screw this up. And it's a really fun mission. But it is the traditional aerospace defense of both Canada and the United States. I actually have to be approved by the Canadian government, and my chain of command, U.S., goes up through the Secretary of Defense and the President. And up the Canadian side, it goes up through their Chief of Defense, their Chairman equivalent, then their Minister of Defense, and then their Prime Minister. But it goes up both. And so I am a Canadian commander of the Canadian Armed Forces. But it is the traditional aerospace, and predominantly aerospace. We have a maritime warning mission, but we execute that through NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM, a little bit more diverse mission set. It encompasses the NORAD mission set, but we execute the aerospace mission inside NORAD. But the rest of the defense of the homeland, we execute in the maritime, and in land, we execute that through Northern Command. When it comes to some other additional responsibilities for NORTHCOM, I'm the advocate for the Arctic, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, the DoD advocate for the Arctic as an assigned task. But I also am assigned as to support the lead federal agency and the defense support to civil authorities, DISCA mission. And most people think of that only in the terms of a weather of mass destruction event. But it encompasses far more than that. Anytime that there's a lead federal agency, we are the supporting agency to them for the Department of Defense. When I look at the aerospace warning mission, quite frankly, the challenge that's confronting us, and I'll throw these and not go too deep unless you want to talk deeper in them in the question and answer period, is the Russian long-range aviation and the Russian cruise missile threat from submarines, subsurface platforms, and surface platforms. It's a little challenge for us because for 57 years, NORAD has been in a defensive crouch where Soviet and Russian long-range aviation would have to come into our battle space, and we would have to deal with them at that. But Russia is delivering qualitatively a much better military than the quantitative military that the Soviet Union had. They have a different doctrine, and you're seeing that qualitatively better military and that doctrine being played out. It's a whole-of-government approach in the Ukraine and now in Syria. As it comes to the defense for the homeland piece of it, they've read our playbook, and they're putting in force, they're fielding cruise missiles that are very, very accurate, very long range, to the point now where they can, in long-range aviation, never leave Russian airspace in range with conventional or nuclear warheads. Targets in critical infrastructure in Canada, the United States, and the Pacific Northwest, and never leave Russian territory in order to do it. A very, very different mission set for us. It forces us to catch arrows instead of trying to go after where we need to go, which is to shoot the archers. Okay? I've been in the cruise missile threat defending since I was a Lieutenant JG, and I've shot over 1,300 cruise missiles in combat. They're very effective, and they're very hard to defend against. And this is a particular challenge for NORAD and for Northern Command. Aerospace control. The challenge that we have there, it's really born of the 9/11 threat, the traditional 9/11 airliner threat that we have pretty much in hand. And we've worked our way down into different mission sets to where now the challenge that we're working against are, here in Washington, D.C., gyrocopters. Right? Everybody understands gyrocopters, which we call Little Nellie. Does anybody know why we call it Little Nellie? Any James Bond fans? Live and Let Die. He's in a gyrocopter. Q made it for him. It shot unlimited bullets and rockets. It was really cool. All right, go Google it. And but the gyrocopter threat, which is one type of threat. The other one is a low, slow threat. Light sport aircraft, very low radar cross-section, very slow-moving, can be mistaken for flocks of geese, and we mistake them every single day in the clutter. That's a different target set that we have to worry about. And then another one, not so much in the threat, but as a safety of flight, the quadricopter, the small quadricopters that Amazon's selling 15,000 a month on. How do we deal with that? So that's that particular threat. When we look at the maritime warning mission, it's the maritime control. It's the intel gaps we have between the U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, and the Canadian Navy. We're pretty well postured to deal with anything that might be coming to the homeland. The question is, what's coming to the homeland? It's the intel gaps that's out there, amount of the maritime traffic that's coming in here. In the Homeland Defense mission, one of the challenges that we have, quite frankly, is the ballistic missile defense. That's our primary mission. We're postured 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year to deal with anything that might come out of North Korea at the homelands. And the challenge that we have on that, we have fits and starts, the type fits and stops that the problem. As we've invested in this weapon system to defend that from the nation. In 2017, I'll have 44 missiles in the ground, most of them up in Alaska at Fort Greely. The challenge is that we're on the wrong side of the cost curve in the ballistic missile defense mission. We're posturing ourselves to shoot down not very expensive rockets with very expensive rockets, shooting bullets with a very expensive bullet on bullet. And whether it's in the ballistic missile defense of the homeland or the theater ballistic missile defense, when I was in Bahrain, Sherry and our two dogs and myself lived under the Iranian theater ballistic missile. The challenge is it's still that bullet on bullet, very expensive, wrong side of the cost curve. We need technology, we need policy, we need capabilities that keeps them left of launch, never lets them launch, kills them on the launch pad, gets them in the boost phase, and not relying at end game, which is where we are today, relying on the end game piece. Let's talk about the Arctic. As the advocate, DoD advocate for the Arctic, it's a little difficult because we're doctrine people. Well, we're not really in the Navy. We don't like doctrine in the Navy, but we call it something else. But doctrinally, there's no term. You can't look in the joint pubs and say an advocate is supposed to do this. That's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is it gets us to answer the question the way we want to answer the question. What are the capabilities and capacities that we need in the Arctic as the world is changing? The challenge is also those that want us to do more than that can use that, well, you're the advocate, you're supposed to go do this. So that's a challenge. I will tell you, I took the first commander's review shortly after I got there, and it was a very good advocate role of the NORAD NORTHCOM advocate role of the Arctic but we're the DoD advocate for the Arctic, so we are reaching out to all of the services and the agencies to answer the capabilities that we need in the Arctic. Right now, it's a harsh place. In order if you want to be up there, you have to be able to do three things well. You have to be able to communicate, you have to be able to navigate, and you have to be able to sustain yourself. And those are capabilities that you just have to have. The question is, when do we need those capabilities in the Arctic? We don't want to be late to need, but in a declining budget cycle that we're in, we can't afford to invest the services and the agencies too soon. So when is the right time to invest in that? Navy's done a good job. Navy's put up their 4th communication satellite, and we're actually communicating with the Coast Guard icebreaker when it made its trek to the North Pole, pretty far up, and I won't go into any details beyond that. But the navigation piece we got to solve, but the hard one's going to be the sustainment piece. It's anywhere from 3 to 15 times more expensive in time and money to operate up in the Arctic. There's the Arctic and there's the Arctic Circle. Anytime you're north of the Arctic, anywhere from 3 to 15, and there's a funny story that goes with that. If you want to hear about it, please ask. The next mission we do is security cooperation. NORTHCOM is a traditional combatant commander. We have battle space. We have countries assigned. I'm lucky enough to only have 3 countries assigned, so we can pay a lot of attention to them. The first is Canada. As a Canadian commander and a Canadian command, binational command, it's pretty easy for that one. Work very closely with Canada. Bahamas, and the third is Mexico. And where we are with Mexico in the last 3 years, phenomenal in our mill-to-mill relationships. If they made a strategic decision to align themselves with North America and with the United States. You know, with Mexico, we share the same history, we share the same values, we share the same work ethic, and we share the same future. And where we are with them, pretty phenomenal, and I look forward to your questions on that. The last one I want to talk to is defense support for civil authorities. Again, too many people think that defense support for civil authorities is a Katrina, a storm, the storm that we have down in South Carolina right now, or an earthquake. That is one of our mission sets to help the lead federal agency, Homeland Security, and to pass it off to FEMA. Craig Fugate, great American story, what the nation's done, what FEMA's done is it's transformed itself since FEMA. It's not told enough to support in that, and we do that. We have forces, DoD forces in alert as we speak, waiting for a request from the state of South Carolina to deal with the massive flooding that they're having down there. Should they ask, we'll be there. We're not going to be late to need. But in the non-traditional role, defense support for civil authorities, this is what, in the defense of the Homeland mission, this is what makes NORTHCOM unique from the other geographic combatant commanders. Again, our mission set goes from tracking Santa to thermonuclear war and everything in between. And you might be able to fail thermonuclear war, but don't fail that Santa business. And, when it comes to the non-traditional threats to the Homeland, in the Homeland, we're not in charge. NORTHCOM's not in charge. We are supporting to a supported commander. And that's why our closest mission partner is Jay Johnson over at Homeland Security, and then working with law enforcement, who's really doing the find, fix, and finish, the legal finish of this particular threat. And that's a little different for us, for those of us in the military, because it's different than it is when you're overseas. And so when we look at that non-traditional threat, you know, we get asked all the time, can you rate the threats to the, what are your threats? And I don't rate them 1 to 20. I go from most likely to most dangerous. And of course, the most dangerous is that thermonuclear war that can annihilate our nation. But it's also the least likely. But the most likely threat is that weather of mass destruction that we're going to be supporting. But when it comes to the non-traditional threat, it is now the threat to the homeland caused by Daesh. And I will not call them ISIL. That gives them too much credit. They don't like the term Daesh, so I call it Daesh. And because it more accurately reflects this organization that's out there. But they have a very sophisticated social media campaign that they're motivating citizens from Western nations to do harm to fellow citizens. And they're using a very, very sophisticated and very effective and robust social media campaign. You can look at the Twitter accounts that they have, and it's thousands of Twitter accounts compared to what Al-Qaeda used and threats before them. And it's motivating, again, citizens to do harm to fellow citizens. There's two types of these threats, these homegrown violent extremists. There's the type that we might pick up, and there's the type that we're not. And I'm most concerned about the types that we're not going to pick up. If someone is communicating back to Daesh on how to carry out these attacks to fellow citizens, then we have sensors out there that we have an opportunity, I repeat, an opportunity to detect, and law enforcement can work those particular cases. And FBI is doing a phenomenal job at that. I'm here to tell you they're doing a phenomenal job against a phenomenal task. The ones I'm most concerned with, though, are those that we're not detecting, those that are not communicating back, that are in the receive mode of this very sophisticated social media campaign. And Daesh has actually released public information of service members and their families and said to do harm to these service members and their families. Well, my role, one of my assigned tasks, is responsible for the force protection conditions and working with the services of all the DOD and the agencies in the Homeland. And I set the force protection condition that the services must follow in order to do that. And this particular threat, there's so much chatter on the net that a few months back, and I spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and then overseas afloat, that there was more chatter on the net pointed against service members and their families that I raised a force protection condition that's for the second time since 9/11 to force protection Bravo in a sustainable manner because of this threat. And this unknown threat is the one that was carried out in Chattanooga. The exact very reason for the unknown threat. Why was this individual motivated to do what he did? We'll never know, but we do know that he was in the receive mode of this issue. And this goes to how do we counter this particular narrative. You know, Daesh's center of gravity, we're trained to identify the enemy's center of gravity, and then you attack the center of gravity. Well, the center of gravity of Daesh, as it relates here to the Homeland, because it's different than the one that's overseas, is their narrative. It's their narrative and the perception of the success of them bringing about the caliphate. Narrative and perception. It is a war of the words, okay? And the fact that we have not yet been able to counter that narrative, that someone actually believes that that's a better way of life than the one that they have here in the United States or in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, and Paris, all of who've had attacks from this narrative, really confounds me. And that's why we have to go after countering this particular narrative. And that narrative is only going to be won at the grassroots level, working with the communities. It's intervention. It's intervention by parents, family members, clergy, schooling, people that would see this troubled youth that might be radicalized through a cycle of radicalization. Write that down so I can say it correctly. And that we have to break that cycle so they don't then act. And it can only be won at the grassroots level, at the local level, at the tactical level. And the government's committed in order to do that. And the challenge here as it comes to me as the Northern Command Commander is that we can't participate in that. We can assist, but we can't participate in that narrative. We have to, this is where it's different. We than overseas, because we're not in charge of that particular effort. And I look forward to your questions on that. And so with that, that's the extent of my prepared remarks. And I look forward to jousting with the master here.
Good. Thanks, Admiral.
Okay?
Well, thank you for that overview. That was terrific. I wanted to pick up where you left off
Okay.
with this narrative, because I think that's really important as we see it today, the ISIS, or as you call it, Daesh narrative now. And you alluded to some of the things that have to be done. But talk about what you see the U.S. government doing, and albeit maybe the U.S. military's role is limited here in the domestic United States. But,
Yeah, well,
but talk about what initiatives you're hearing about through the government, through DHS, NCTC.
Well, our effort started in 2011 as a nation. And we are currently, the nation is now, the government, whole of government approach in this is going about, is that process from 2011 working? And is there more things that we can do to be more effective on it? And that's where we are right now, and I'm not able to talk into much more detail than that, but that's what the President has us doing right now, a whole of government approach on how that we look at it. And some people may be critical that, well, why are you changing your approach from 2011? I think the American people want us to change our approach. I mean, we all, in your business, you plan, you execute, you assess, and as you go through the assessment process, can you be better? What is working, what's not working, and let's do it. And that's where we are at this particular point.
Can you give us some hint as where the shift is taking place in terms of the
Well,
this narrative
I'm-
and the grassroots approach?
I don't have enough detail to give you an indication. It isn't that I'm trying to hide it. I just don't have enough detail because we're not the key support team commander in this effort. I will tell you that we've offered planning assistance because we know how to plan and know how to assist. But I don't know if, I'm pretty confident we're not the right answer there because of the way this message has to be transmitted and who has to transmit this message. It has to be done at the local level. You know, we're an amazing country. We can sell Coca-Cola anywhere in the world. But this is not Coca-Cola. We have to go after and break this path of radicalization. It has to be done. It can only be done at the local level, where the family, the community are the censors, and they determine that there's a troubled youth out there, and then they get that troubled youth on the right path. We have tons of capability to assist once we've identified the individual, but how do you get someone to identify the individual? What if it's your child? Who do you want to go? Do you want to come forward if it's your child? These are tough decisions, and it's going to be a long slog, which is why I don't think we'll be coming out of Force Protection Condition Bravo for quite some time yet.
So the threat is still at roughly the same level or greater than
Only
when you
because
started?
we don't know about the threat. You know, we look at threat reports and threat streams. You know, it's never clean. It never, like a story just doesn't come to you, right? You have to go and dig and pull the pieces together. Well, we get little snippets of information for a threat report, or we tie a couple of them together and that turns it into a stream. But we want to make an objective assessment from a very subjective process. And so what we do is we measure all these threat reports against 4 attributes: credibility, specificity, imminency, and plausibility. Now, CSIP. Now, those might not be in the right order, but it's the only way I can remember the 4 numbers. But what's easy, this is a credible threat and it's a plausible threat. What we're lacking here is the specificity and the imminency, the where and the when. If we have the where and the when, and the FBI has the where and the when, they're going to do something. If it's targeted against a military installation or a member of our families and we got the where and the when, boy, we're all in. We can do what we need to do. But lacking that where and that when, it's the unknown. And if it's one of these extremists that, again, is motivated just in the receive mode and chooses to go take action, that's the concern. And we're never going to have that where and that when against those particular threats. So I've got the staff working with the intel community on what are the strategic and operational indicators that we might see that might get us to roll back these force protection conditions. And it's going to be pretty glacial because they're strategic and operational indicators, and those things just don't pop out at you.
Now, you mentioned Chattanooga and the tragedy there this summer and the shootings there. To many people, their interaction with the military, to the extent they may have it today, is with these kind of storefront recruiting stations and all. There were some calls to have armed guards outside. You have some control over that, right? What do you think should be done in moving forward if this threat still is at that kind of heightened level?
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is that, well, overseas we have 3 types of risk: risk of mission, risk to the force executing the mission, and risk to the long-term health of the force. And the combatant commanders and their components own the risk to mission. The service chiefs own the risk, share the risk to the force executing the mission, and then the service chiefs own the long-term health of the force as they're trying to meet the near-term needs of the geographic combatant commanders. It's different for here in the homeland, because I have the authority to close recruiting stations, and I have the authority to harden recruiting stations. But who owns the risk to that mission of recruiting? I don't own that risk, that mission. The service chiefs do. And so, you know, we put in place measures that are what we call sustainable, that the services can execute over the long haul, because I could mandate something that they can't afford, and I'm not going to do that. I'm going to work with them. But they have to determine whether or not any of those actions would impact their ability to recruit. They own that risk of that mission. And so that's why we work very, very closely with the services to determine, answer those particular questions. Another one are the ROTC units. How would it be if we armed up the ROTC units on our college campuses and we hardened them up? probably would have an effect on those ROTC units. So I'm not worried about air stations and naval bases and where we have nuclear weapons and I'm not worried about those. No one's that dumb to come after those targets. It's those what we call soft targets, recruiting stations, ROTC units. Our families live out, most of our families, us and our families, live outside the wire with the community. You know, those are the targets that I'm most concerned with, and we have to work with the services on those answers.
I'm going to pull back now from the threat inside the country to one of the major threats that you're talking about here from outside, and that is Russia. And what is going on here? You mentioned the cruise missile threat. I know in our previous conversations we've talked about their long-range bombers this summer flying within 40 miles of the San Francisco Bay Area, right on the 4th of July.
That's correct.
Coincidental.
Wishing the pilots happy birthday.
But now, as you mentioned in your remarks, we have the Russians becoming much more involved in Syria. I want you to draw on your expertise both from your days in the Middle East and kind of what you're watching there, but also you've probably had to become a student, as many of us have, of Vladimir Putin and trying to divine in some way what is in his mind. What is he up to here? What's his end game, if you will, from what you've seen in your time, obviously kind of watching mostly from the NORTHCOM hat. What do you think's going on in Moscow?
Well, first off, I'm a firm believer that if you want to defend the nations, you do it as an away game. It's most effective on the away game where the root causes are. And so I tell all my friends overseas, the EUCOM commander, the CENTCOM commander, the AFRICOM commander, the PACOM, please fix your country so my job can get a lot easier, please. They fail to see the humor in it. But as you look into the Middle East, you know, we're seeing a shift in the Middle East. It's gonna be a generational shift. And it's a war between haves and have-nots, unfortunately, which we have debates in this country between haves and have-nots. But what you're seeing over there is the shift of the traditional Shia and Sunni leadership role, haves and have-nots. It's divided along religious lines, and it's going to have to play out for a while before we see what's going to happen. Now, this battle between Shia and Sunni has been going on for a few centuries, so it's not going to get solved anytime sooner. When I look at Putin, I'm a history major. My father bought my degree, you know, between the time that the fall of the Berlin Wall and Putin coming to power, I believe was, help me out here, Paulette, 7 years? 7 years is a blink of an eye in the war between nation states. It's only been 25 years from the fall of the Soviet Union. And you think back, how long does it take in history for us to really see the ramifications of a fall of an empire? Now, we're from America. You know, we're fast food, ATM machines. You know, everything's instantaneous. But you really think about the ramifications of it. We're just now seeing the ramifications. Putin's shaped by that. And so is his leadership and his military leadership. They think that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest travesty in the history of Russia. And they want to make up for it. What's interesting this time, though, is that you're not seeing him bring back the Soviet Union. You look at the tapestry and the symbolism, it's Tsarist Russia. And so I really think that what you see and what they're trying to do is right at the core of the Russian DNA that Russia's had since the Tsar's time. So that's how it's playing out. And they have a pretty tight decision-making cycle. They don't have a balance of power as we know it, right? Which we know gets to the right decision eventually, but it just doesn't come quick. His decision-making cycle is him. And he's opportunistic. If he sees an opportunity, he's going to move into that particular space. You know, the Ukraine was an opportunistic move. There was no planning for that. He saw an opportunity and he took it. And I think he saw an opportunity in his eyes in Syria, and that's why he moved in there. One, he's been a loyal ally there for a long time. It's his only Mediterranean port for his Navy that's been there, and there's been a huge amount of advisors that are in there. And it really complicated a very complicated situation. You know, when you look into Syria and Iraq, you know, we have to remember, why have we been hesitant of going in there? Why have we been criticized for not going in there? And you have to ask yourself that, all right, we want to deal with Daesh. How long do you think it would take for the United States Army and the Marine Corps and combined arms to take care and plant those guys? How long? I'd give us, I'm not that good. I'd give 60 days. And then what? And then what? We weren't happy for the phase 4, how long it was after we went into Iraq. And this is again, a shift within the Middle East of the power struggle between Shia and Sunni. And we're going to be there for a really long time this time. And that's really the cause. That's what causes me pause.
But in terms of his deployments, these long-range bomber flights, other things, do you see this as basically putting the United States on notice that I am trying to reestablish this old power?
No,
or do you actually see,
I
how much
see
of a real threat to the homeland do you see these?
He's messaging us. So he's telling us that he's a global power. You know, when the airline was shot down, he flew long-range aviation down the English Channel, and he was off of Canada and Alaska right after that. He's messaging us. 4th of July, he's off of San Francisco. Happy birthday to you American pilots. Same time, Putin called the president. Exact same time. I don't think that was a coincidence. You know, he's messaging us. We message too. We do Freedom of Navigation Acts. We do long-range aviation flights. We do the same sort of thing. He's doing the same thing to us. My question is, what happens in a crisis? In their doctrine, much like the Chinese doctrine, they're going to escalate in order to de-escalate. They will kinetically escalate in a crisis to de-escalate the crisis. And my question is now, what if they do that in one of our crises? What if he shoots a conventional cruise missile to maybe not so important critical infrastructure in Alaska? What would that do to our national decision-making cycle? I think we need to work our way through that.
Are you wargaming that?
Yeah, we are working our way through that, as a matter of fact. Because
what are the results? What happens?
Well, that's classified, Eric. I can't tell you. You know what it does do?
But does it end badly? I mean, or is it?
No, what it does is it
the results
freezes our
surprise you?
decision-making cycle. Is it an Article 5 declaration? Is there an Article 5 declaration out of that if he takes out Cobra Dane in Alaska? In the Aleutians, you know, and in our war games, Jeff can tell you, it froze the decision-making calculus as we try and get to an answer. And you know, you want to stay inside your opponent's decision-making cycle. That's the whole purpose. If you can stay inside that cycle, we're never going to be inside of his cycle because he's the cycle. But we need to tighten up ours a little bit, and we have time. I think we have time to work our way through those, you know, those decisions, and that's what we're working through.
Let me just tick through a few of the other threats. One that's often related to the Russians, the Chinese, Iranians, cyber threat.
Yeah.
Talk about Northcom's role within the U.S. government in terms of both defensive.
I only have 2 assigned tasks when it comes to cyber. One is to protect my networks. And I have, under Northcom, I have no NORAD cyber tasks. And then the second task is to support the lead federal agency in the physical aftermath of a cyber attack. And we're going to do those 2 particular tasks. The second one we're ready to do any particular day, and I can tell you our networks, we work pretty hard to protect our own networks. I think the cyber threat, though, I'm trying to shift the conversation a little bit beyond that. I don't think we have a true understanding of our interdependencies, of the critical infrastructure that we are reliant upon in order to do our mission. Now, we have a list of critical infrastructure that we want to protect. I personally think that's about 20% of the stuff we need to protect because I don't think we fully understand, again, those interdependencies that we have in the public and private sector that we are reliant upon. I'll give you one. If there is a cyber attack that brings down the Ottawa power grid, the northeast quadrant of the United States, I can't defend. I'm reliant upon that power grid. Think about in order to do defense support for civil authorities, we want to move by rail. What if there's a cyber attack on a rail installation? You know, these are privately held companies that need to ensure that they can function. And we may not know we are reliant upon that particular company just because of those interdependencies. So that's where I think we need to go. We need stricter cyber policy and cyber laws in our nation to harden up those particular targets.
The U.S. and China recently struck a deal when the Premier was here talking about cyber arrangements. DNI Clapper raised some issues, I think, about how confident he was that that would hold. Do you share some of the reservations about that as you look at China and this particular responsibility you have?
They're robbing our intellectual capital blind.
The Chinese are.
Chinese are. They can't keep their industry moving without robbing our intellectual capital from our private industry, and they're robbing us blind. They're going to have to show me that they're going to stop. I just don't see it happening.
You mentioned North Korea in your remarks. You've talked before about your belief in the assessment in U.S. intelligence community that the North Koreans have successfully miniaturized a nuclear warhead to put on one of these long-range missiles. There's talk of an impending missile test coming up. What do you make right now of the North Koreans, their intentions?
I agree with the intel community that we assess that they have the ability, they have the weapons, that they have the ability to miniaturize those weapons, and they have the ability to put them on a rocket that can range the homelands. And as the defender of North America, the United States officially in a ballistic missile defense, I think the American people expect me to take the threat seriously, and so that's what we do. It's the pragmatic, it's the right approach. The question is when will he use it? Why would he use it? Those are all questions that no one really understands because no one really understands the great leader. I look longingly for the predictable nature of the great leader's father. Yeah, some of you got that. So I just don't know, but we're ready for him, and we're ready 24 hours a day should he be dumb enough to shoot something at us.
Talk a little bit about trying to get inside the head of yet another dictator, Kim Jong-un. How does that work here, and what is there any insights that you can take away from him now that he's been in power a couple of years?
Again, he's solidifying his power base. His form of non-judicial punishment is pretty interesting, shooting people with anti-aircraft guns. And he is just not predictable. And so, we can live with some pretty ugly opponents as long as they're predictable. This guy, I just can't predict. Now, fortunately, I just have to deal with the receiving end. To get the real answer, you need to talk to Harry Harris at PACOM. It's his problem that ends up here. But I tell you, it's just a very, very unpredictable and unstable situation over there. People forget that the peninsula, it's an armistice. So when we look at phases of war, phase 0, phase 1, escalation, the crisis, the escalation, decisive, and phase 4, the restoration. Where are we on the peninsula? Where's an armistice in that? It sure isn't phase 0. They're somewhere between phase 1 and phase 2, and the South Korean government's not putting up with it anymore. And so it's pretty unstable there on the peninsula. You just need to go around the world and see the threats that my shipmates that are overseas are dealing with. Coming out of every major war, there's a 27 to 32% reduction out of our budget. This goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War, and so we need to accept that. But what's different this time, as we're coming out of 14 years of war, usually when you come out of war, you're in a better international security environment than when you went into war, and that's just not the case. You just go around. You look at the Korean Peninsula. You look at China and the South China Sea. That's phase 1. That's not phase 0. You look at Pakistan and India. They've never been great friends. The last time I checked. You look at what's the ongoing fight and effort in Afghanistan. You look at ISIL, Daesh. You look at Iran, the nuclear question, and state-sponsored terrorism, there's no question about that from Iran. You look at the mass migration challenges out of Africa into southern Europe, transnational criminal networks. The world is pretty unstable right now, and I think it goes back to, it's only been 25 years from the good old days of the stable, predictable Cold War, I think we're seeing 25 years later the ramifications of the fall of that particular era in our history.
The Arctic is on the minds of many right now, both the challenges and the opportunities. Talk a little bit more about this advocacy job. You have advocate for the Arctic and where that's taking the Defense Department.
Yeah, we're taking this on a fact-based approach, because when you look at the Arctic, there's two schools of thought. The extremes are people are going to go there for their summer vacation instead of the Bahamas next year, and there's another group that says, well, it's no different, it's hard ice. And so, of course, like in most issues, the center is where the truth is. Actually, it's more dangerous up there than it's ever been. The impact. There's no question in our mind that the Arctic
why is it more dangerous?
Because it's not hard ice anymore. So I was meeting with the last senator from Colorado, and he's an outdoor enthusiast, and he has a friend that tries to go to the North Pole every year, and he started off on snowmobiles, and now he has to wear a dry suit because going in and out of crevices and things of that nature. It's very, very dangerous out there. And so what we need to know is what are the ramifications in that, and when do we need to lay in those resources in order to deal with it? The question, the Arctic is so important for the defense of the homeland because of its location. It's an avenue of an attack from space and from the air. The world's round. It's a good avenue of attack. That's the strategic importance of Alaska for us. It's also the place where interests and geography intersect. And where those interests are is the science of where does a continental shelf end and where does a continental shelf start. And in the Arctic, they're all going to show up together. Now, all of the nations have decided to agree the international governance structure to arbitrate those. Us and Canada have a dispute, I think, in 3 areas. And as long as the nations choose to use it that way, then we'll be okay as a flashpoint.
That form's been effective so far?
I think the science is still too young. I think they're still working through it because it's different. And once again, it's science, and there's probably some subjectivity and not physics in that science. But everybody's agreed to use it on that regard. Shell just pulled out. They were doing their exploratory, I think 3 or 4 wells, and they just decided they're not going to do it. And I'd be interesting to see that. When will people go back up there? I think that's a good question to ask. We'll just have to wait and see, because everybody was waiting to see what Shell was going to do.
You talked about the Russians probably getting more involved up in there. Obviously, their territory extends well up into the Arctic area. Do you see the United States getting more involved in a military way up there? And is there a potential for the militarization of the Arctic?
Well, I think we already have militarized the Arctic. Their boomers are under the ice. Our submarines are where their boomers are. So it's from the air and space, it's an attack vector. So I'd have to say it's already militarized. Name a domain that someone hasn't militarized if they see an advantage tactically, operationally, or strategically. So I think that's a moot point. The question is there a flashpoint up there for us? I will tell you, if we get to shooting, yes, there'll be some bears going down, guarantee it. But the question I get asked is, what are they doing along their Arctic bases? And what they're doing in their Arctic bases is they're putting money back into facilities that they let atrophy after the fall of the Cold War. Now, they have the longest ice-free zone, longest time, but they need that in order to get their resources out and then resources back in. So they have every reason to do that. They have the longest landmass on the second longest landmass on the Arctic. The longest is Canada, not by as the crows flies, but if you go by pure territory. So I don't have any problem with them investing up there. Did I tell you it's somewhere between 3 and 15 times more expensive in time and money, closer to the 10 to 15 than the 3? And if they want to invest their defense dollars up there, let them. They're not investing them somewhere else.
The president.
What was the story with that?
Oh, right. You mentioned in your remarks about a story.
Yeah. Oh, when I got there, my staff said it was three times more expensive, and I go up to Inuvik, which is the northernmost NORAD and Canadian Air Force base, 6,000 feet long, north of the Arctic Circle, and I'm with a Canadian Special Forces 1-star who's assigned to the Joint Staff, and he says, no, it's 10 times more expensive. So I said, okay, that's good enough for me. He's operated up there somewhere between 3 and 10. 3 weeks ago, I had the 2-star head of the Canadian Intel Center, who, when he was a battalion commander, he needed to move his battalion in Canada 600 nautical miles north. And he said it was 15 times more expensive in time and money to move it to Afghanistan than it was to move it 600 miles north in Canada. So, I mean, they've done it. They've been responsible for the math. So I use 3 to 15, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. But it's expensive in time and money. You get up to Inuvik, it's fascinating, fascinating. Everything's built on stilts. They have about 45 days in the summer where they can barge in all the fuel that they're going to need for the entire year, and then it goes as ice is over again. We go to a hotel that evening, and we pull up, and the building looks just like everything else in the town. And I said, this is the hotel? And they said, yeah, we don't ship pretty up here. It's got to be functional. It is a harsh place. Canada pays 14,000 Canadian to every one of their citizens for every man, woman, and child that will live up there. A lot of kids. I said, where do you get the teachers? They said, we pay them a lot of money. So it's a harsh place, you know, we'll figure out the communication and navigation. The sustainment piece. The sustainment piece is going to be the long pole in the tent.
I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience in just a minute, but I wanted to ask the Admiral one last question. That is, as we sit here in Washington, we're watching the President and his national security team wrestle with what seems an interminable number of crises. You've got the situation in Iraq and Syria, of course, now apparently more complicated by the Russian involvement. You have the tragedy in Afghanistan and Kunduz, and the questions before the President about how many forces to keep in Afghanistan going after next year. Tell us what it's like to be in the room, whether it's the Situation Room or via VTC with President Obama, what his style's like, what kind of questions he asks you as a commander.
Never been in the room.
Okay.
Got an interview, and that was it.
Yeah.
Next question.
Yeah. What was it like? What kind of guy is he?
When I interviewed with him, I was struck by how tired he was.
And so when was this?
Oh, let me see. That would have been back in, I don't know, August, September of last, maybe a year ago. So pick a crisis, and you can figure out what he was tired about. I was struck by how tired he was. Immense challenges that are out there. And we're here to give him the best military advice that we possibly can. I don't hear from him much from NORAD and NORTHCOM or from Washington, D.C., and as my old J5, that's a good thing. You know, if anybody here in Washington, D.C. hears from NORTHCOM or NORAD, and it's not tracking Santa, it's not a good day for America. And so we're okay not being in the press. We're okay with not being in the VTCs. The American people and the Canadian people need to know if they need us, we're there. We'll be ready. And we exercise and we work real hard to be ready. But we're not looking for press because, once again, it's a bad day for America if you're talking NORTHCOM.
Well, Admiral, thank you very much for this discussion. I'd like to open it up to the audience now. We're going to have some microphones going around. Please stand and just introduce yourself if you would, and please keep it to a question, not a statement. Do we have? Yeah, okay. How about right here?
Peter Husey from the Air Force Association. I don't want to complicate your life, but when you look south, we don't have early warning radars or defenses, and the North Koreans, as you know, have launched this rocket in a southerly direction. Where is that on your priority list to either recommend or look at defenses looking south, whether radars or interceptors?
Yeah. Well, it goes to, I need sensors where I predict the threat is and where the threat's going to be. So in that particular regard, I don't necessarily see that as an insurmountable problem given other priorities that are out there. Okay.
Right here.
Hi, I'm Blake. First, thanks for your service. I'm from Senator Tim Kaine's office, so you've probably heard similar questions in hearings, but what are the biggest gaps that you're seeing in readiness when it comes to this budget environment, particularly with your support of civil defense. You know, DoD gets relief from the budget constraints through OCO funding to support that 050 budget activity, whereas, you know, a lot of your partners in the home front, the FBI, DHS, you know, they don't get similar support. They don't get similar relief. So what are the major gaps in readiness that you're seeing because of this budget environment that we have right now?
Well, when I testified to the SASC, in my opening statement, I went through the threats to the homeland from the most likely to the most dangerous. And this was back in, when did I testify, Jeff? March timeframe. And I went through the most likely to the most dangerous threats that I see them to NORAD and NORTHCOM. But I said the most likely and the most dangerous threat to NORAD and NORTHCOM and our ability to execute our mission is sequestration. And I firmly believe that. And that's because NORTHCOM and NORAD, we don't own forces. I actually only muster about 2,500 a day, predominantly doing the Noble Eagle mission and the ballistic missile defense mission, and they're predominantly guardsmen, soldiers and airmen, and they do phenomenal work for us. The rest of it is service retained, which means the services come help me do my mission. They report back to the services, and it's funded through the services. It's not my money. And most of that when they come, they're training themselves to then go forward deploy, if that makes sense. So they're receiving training doing my mission that we have, whether it's on the border or whether it's our mill-to-mill with Mexico, mill-to-mill training activity with Mexico and with the Bahamas. Sequestration happens. The only place the services can get money is out of operations and maintenance, which is where that work comes from. I know because of my last job, I was Fleet Forces Command, the readiness provider for the Navy, and that's what I had to cut back on, and part of the stuff I had to cut back on was support to Chuck Jacoby, who is my predecessor, who I worked for. So that impact on me doing that, as well as my ability for them to do the work for defense support for civil authorities, and then the impact on my mission partners who are doing that work, Homeland Security, you know, Coast Guard's not going to get funded. My gosh, that is a terrible problem for us, and all of the elements of Homeland Security and law enforcement. So that all gets impacted by sequestration. So it has huge impacts. The other are the impacts overseas. And so, did I tell you this is an away game? Homeland Defense is an away game. And so I wasn't worried about the naval forces in the away game. I was worried about who their reliefs are going to be. The guys that were there are trained, guys and gals are trained, ready to go. When am I going to be able to bring them home? And when is their readiness level going to atrophy? So that's why I advocate for to give the services and MDA the money that they need in order to do the missions that the nation's asking them to do. And as long as the services get the money that they say they need, and MDA gets the money that they need because they provide the ballistic missile defense mission for me, we'll be able to do the mission for the nation. Right here.
Thanks, sir. Andrea Shalal with Reuters. I wanted to draw you back to the area of missile defense and your comment about being forced to sort of shoot at the arrows instead of the, the
Wrong side of the cost curve?
wrong side of the cost
Yeah.
curve. And there are a lot of emerging threats. What's your current understanding of how far along North Korea is in terms of developing warheads that would shoot multiple?
Well, we assess that
US
they have the capability to reach the homeland with a nuclear weapon from a rocket. We assess that they have that capability. We've put in place the systems to deal with that, and that's what we're prepared to do. So the question is that the path that we're on, that we've been put on, is very expensive. Excuse me. Pardon. I'm allergic to you, Eric. We're on that wrong side of that cost curve. We have to invest on being able to defeat that threat through multiple times through its flight path, from before it launches to where we do now at endgame. And we need to be able to put more warheads up in space, and we need better sensors to discriminate what is a warhead and what is a decoy or just a piece of debris, so we knock those threats out before they get to the homeland.
So I mean, I guess the question is you know, you've had long delays in terms of getting those interceptors, getting everything ready. Those interceptors haven't proven as reliable. You've done some testing now, but there's still a lot of problems in terms of, you know, your shot doctrine in terms of being able to shoot the interceptors. You know, how far behind are you, and how quickly are they pacing?
Well, I'm pretty
you know, gonna
comfortable
catch-
with our shot doctrine. It's pretty well modeled by MDA, and I won't go into the specifics of that because we're in an open forum. I'm pretty confident that we're gonna knock down the numbers that are going to be shot at us. The challenge is, and I'm not going to make excuses for how we got where we are. I couldn't even paint that story for you very well of the politics and decisions and why they were made and the funding. But we are where we are, and I'm completely aligned with Admiral Jim Searing, who's in charge of MDA, in command of MDA. And what we testified for, and what we have in the current NDAA, is the proper funding in 3 areas. The first, and they're not in order. They all have to be done concurrently. First is, we want to make what we have as best as we can possibly make it. So that modernizing it and its operations and its maintenance and the testing of it, we want to make what we have as the best we can possibly make it. We want to invest in better sensors. Okay, those are necessary investments no matter where we go. We want to have better sensors so that we can see better, and that allows us to make better decisions with what we have. And then we need the necessary investments in the future to get us on the correct side of the cost curve, you know, to engage this particular threat. And what's important about that is that those technologies not only will play out not only in the ballistic missile defense for the homeland, but the theater ballistic missile defense for our forces that are overseas that live under those threats today as well. And fortunately, in the NDAA, as it's currently standing, all of those investments are in there for MDA, and we're grateful for our legislators to put that in there, and we'll be okay. The challenges with sequestration for MDA is that they don't have the big ops and maintenance account that the surface can go to make the bad business decisions that the law forces us to make. They'll have to go to those new starts, and that goes into the sensors, and it's going to go into that getting on the correct side of the cost curve for those particular missions. Okay.
Over here.
Hi, Brian Everstein with Air Force Magazine. Earlier you talked about the threat of cruise missiles and the need to shoot down the Archer. And earlier this year you signed an order for upgraded AESA radars for your F-16s. I was wondering if you can give us an update on where that stands.
As it stands right now, funding for the AESA is in there, the AESA radars. But they're not in conflict. Again, you want to be able to, it's a kill chain. Your opponent has a kill chain. And your opponent has to put in place and do everything along this in order for the weapon to have an effect. And what we want to be able to do is break that kill chain in as many places as we possibly can. Okay, so the AESA is an end-game break. And so we want to have AESA on our F-16s that defend the national capital region. Quite frankly, we want AESA capability on all of our 4th-gen fighters because they're going to go overseas and fight the fight. We want to have, but for the national capital region, we want them end game for that particular piece. We also want the ability to kill that Archer long before, so that AESA-equipped F-16 or F-15 or F-18 is dealing with a leaker and not dealing with a salvo. Does that make sense? So I want to start knocking them down as far as we can. And so those are the investments we've asked for to counter that kill chain. Okay.
In the back, Jim.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, Admiral. Good to see you again. North America is more than just the United States and Canada. There is Mexico. So I'm just curious. You mentioned that you're having excellent relations with Mexico. Now, 5 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. Could you give us a little more detail on that? And sort of a second question, I guess, is a lot of the threats that come through Mexico originate in the area that's covered by U.S. Southern Command. I'm just curious about your relationship with the folks there.
Mexico and then John Kelly. Right? Okay. About 3 years ago, Mexico made a strategic decision to align themselves with North America and particularly with the United States for the reasons that I talked about in my opening statement. And it's showing itself out. Now, we're responsible for the mill-to-mill relationship, working with Sedena and Samar, their Army and Air Force and their Navy and the Marine Corps. And it's unheard of. You said 5 years ago, I'd say 3 years ago, we wouldn't see what we're seeing today. General Cienfuegos and Admiral Soberon are friends. It's very clear to me they're friends in my engagements with them. And they are committed to do what their nations ask them to do, to work on their internal problems, while they still want to be a big Army and a big Navy, to be outwardly focused as well as they're inwardly focused for the fight that their nations ask them to fight. Our metrics, foreign military sales between H-60s, Humvees, ammunition, the training we're doing with them, the Ops Intel Fusion process as they're working that internal fight, outstrip the capability that we've given them. They've just embraced it and are running with it. And they're taking bad people off the battlefield. They're taking bad people off the battlefield. They're having great effects. So what if I could ask for anything when I work the Hill is the government to government. We need continued political pressure, political to political, government to government pressure to get the other elements of power, other departments within Mexico to tackle the individual challenges that they all are confronted. Now, let's not be naive. This is a long fight that they're in. This is a long fight. And we need to be right there with them to help them where they want to help, where they want help, at the pace that they want help. I learned when I was in Bahrain, first time working for Admiral Keating as his chief of staff, was that you only go as fast as your partners want to go. And if you try and go faster than your partners want to go, it takes you longer to get there. And so, once again, we're engaged with them with probably 10 to 15 training teams every single day. And they want to help. They want the training, and they're employing that training. But it's so successful, we're treating them like we do other regular militaries. November the 13th, I was driving down there 2 trips ago, and I noticed that at their military academy, they have a football field, an American football field. So I asked General Cienfuegos, hey, you want to play some football? How about Army-Navy? And so I'm taking the U.S. Naval Academy sprint football team, which are 170 and below, on November the 13th, and we're going to go play an Army-Navy game against the Mexican military cadets. It's going to be a lot of fun. John Kelly, the threat from the south. Yeah, what you're seeing predominantly in the migration is from the very poor conditions in Central America. That's the cause. That's the root problem there. And immense challenges. And John Kelly is doing a phenomenal job tackling those immense challenges, partnering with those nations in order to do it, in order to help them along. John's staff and myself met with Sedena and Samar. Sedena and Samar flew to my headquarters to brief us on our southern border campaign. What does the campaign structure look like? Who's responsible for it? What is Sedena and Samar's relief in that? And we noticed that we want to partner together, John Kelly's staff and mine, with Mexico and then with the Central American countries, and tackle this in a more holistic manner. And that's where we're off to. They're doing pretty. They're far more effective than they want to give themselves credit to. But I was very impressed with their border efforts and what they've done over the last 2 years when I was down on their Mexican-Guatemalan border and seeing those particular challenges. Pretty impressive. Can they do more? Absolutely. Are they working it hard? They're working it as hard as they've got the time and the money in order to do it. John and I, we have a video teleconference once a month. The seams between geographic combatant commanders is a pet peeve of mine. And so we get together in a VTC once a month, which forces good behavior from the staffs to interact. We do the same thing with PACOM and with STRATCOM on an every other month basis because that's the necessity. You know, if you look into your seams, you'll find your enemy. And we don't want those seams. We want to look into those seams. And when it comes to the threats coming up through that area, we're focused on the drugs, but we don't want to be exclusively focused on the drugs because drugs is a means for us to look into those seams and look left to the right for the nefarious activity that someone may use those seams against us. The heroin production of methamphetamines in Mexico, whose precursors come from China, and the heroin that is being produced, and both of them coming up, real huge challenge that both of our nations must work together to tackle.
Over here.
Yeah, I'm Buktan Kruko. I'm a retired teacher from Toronto. I need your response regarding Putin's denials. They're becoming numerous, and I'm just questioning whether you're doing enough, or whatever agency should be doing is doing enough to provide concrete evidence and put it forth that would challenge those denials, because there's a lot of military support, military people in Ukraine, and he's been caught denying a lot of, there's a lot of provocation, and now currently we've got some mixed messages and denials. So what can you do? And I need your response, first of all, regarding all this, and then what can you do to put forth concrete evidence that would challenge this? Because I don't see enough evidence in the press, and he's getting equal press.
Yeah. Well, first off, I don't claim to be an expert on Putin or Russia. So I'll put that out as a disclaimer on that. But I do have an opinion. They don't care if they tell the truth. If a lie works for them, they're going to tell a lie. Who are they transmitting that message to? And do people care? They're just going to take it as for face value. Perception's reality. So he doesn't care what he's saying. Is he marketing? Is he telling that message to us, or is he telling that message to his people? I'd say he's targeting his people, and it's taken the effect. You look at his popularity. This popularity is 90, 90s, mid 90s. So they're buying it. So our challenge is to tell the truth. We live in the greatest country in the world. We live in a democratic society, which may not be pretty all the time, like currently, but we eventually get to the right answer. It's the checks and balances that gets there. And we are blessed with a free press, right? Who tell the truth, who get the truth out most of the time. And it was a joke, Eric. Anyway, but they don't have that free press. They can say whatever they want. They control the media. This is part of their doctrine, which is a whole of government approach, and a key element of it is their messaging, is their communication, and they don't have to tell the truth. And so it's imperative that we continue to tell the truth, and if you talk to General Breedlove, the SAC-T commander, he works with his NATO leadership in telling the truth as he knows it, the truth in the classified form. This is the real truth. This is what's really happening. But you still, whoever, you can try and sell water, but if people don't want to drink it, they're not going to drink it. And so we just have to continue pressing to tell the truth, and point out when they're not telling the truth, they're not telling the truth. But again, we say it, and he doesn't care because he's marketing to a different audience.
We've got time for about one more question. Is there one last question out there? Anybody burning desire? Okay, one more right here.
So just a quick question on the Arctic. The president has called for increased investment in icebreakers, and you've talked a little bit about the kind of, investment that the Russians are making in that region. How imperative is that to you? And then just to follow up on your earlier point about the NDAA, the president has threatened to veto that bill. What will that do if that bill isn't enacted and you wind up with a long-term CR? Or something short of an NDA in terms of your confidence now in terms of the investments that you say you need both in sensors and radars?
Well, we don't set the priorities. Our elected leadership set the priorities, and we'll fund to the priorities. As a naval officer, we don't have any icebreakers. We don't have a mission for icebreakers. It's the Coast Guard's mission. Coast Guard, if that's a priority, then Homeland Security needs to be funded to fund the Coast Guard to build the icebreakers. But right now, we don't see a need. I'm speaking for John Richardson, who's the Chief of Naval Operations, but we don't have icebreakers in our budget because we don't see it as one of our critical capability and capacity shortfalls. But if
Do you see a role for the Navy in that event? Do you see something emerging if the Coast Guard is?
we're up there today, ma'am. You know?
No, I mean, as far as taking control of the icebreaking mission.
No, I don't see that, because in our nation, that role is assigned to the United States Coast Guard. Now, if somebody wants to assign it to the United States Navy, then they can assign it to the United States Navy, but also the resources and capability and capacity in order to do that, because if we get that, if the Navy gets that, then what is it that you want your Navy not to do? I mean, that's the question you need to ask. And these are trades. You know, there's again, 27 to 32% reduction in the budget coming out of war. There's going to be some tough trades, and tough decisions need to be made. And as we look forward, I recommend that we make all these decisions and we make them based on reversibility. Don't make an irreversible decision. The situation's going to change. Did we think the world order, the international security environment, is going to be the way it was today? Did we predict it 3 years ago? I don't think so. You know, who would want to be an intel officer or a weather guy? They get it wrong all the time. And you know, irreversible decisions you better think real hard about. And telling the Navy to go build icebreakers and then maintain man-training equipment, operate icebreakers, and not give them the resources and the manpower in order to do that, well, then the Navy's going to have to not do something. And I don't think there's things that you want there's more important things you want your Navy to do. If the Coast Guard sees it as a requirement, yes, they're my closest, you know, they're my second favorite service, believe it or not, and no Marines in here. But I've commanded Coasties, they're phenomenal. They do phenomenal work for us.
Admiral, thank you very much for your time and your assessments.
Okay, thanks,
Appreciate
Eric.
it. Thank you all very much for your questions and attention.